Welcome back to the Rhetoric Review podcast. It's quite nice to be here back on a more regular schedule because the last few weeks have been, on and off, and it's good to be going on that, weekly, bi-weekly kind of thing, depending on if I have good ideas or not. And this is going to be more of, like the regular videos I used to do. Like the last one, libertarianism, it's kind of politics. I don't touch that way too much. And then the ones before that were me reading out some essays I wrote, which again, I don't think I'll really do that again. Those didn't perform too well view-wise. But here we are today going over why the world is so sterile. And honestly, I forgot to do the whole intro flip thing, so I guess I'll do it now. Alright, so now that we're here, we're going to talk about why the world is so sterile, and this is something I've been seeing for a while now. Not only on the YouTube sphere, but also on, real life and other platforms as well. And a lot of it does have to do with suburbanization, as we'll get into later on in the video, but a lot of it just has to do with general complaints over car culture. Walkability is a big thing, but also the general feel we get not only as grown up people who are becoming adults, and adults themselves, but as a general criticism of suburban urban life in America and across the modern world. And we'll get into a little bit of criticism of modern architecture soon on, but let's start by going over what a modern building might look like normally. So this is your quintessential normal office building, right? This is KPMG, great provider. I mean, huge company, got one in my local area. This is not the picture, of course. And, you see very obvious things here. Okay, you got, a lot of glass, monochrome colors, you got some interesting geometric shapes, but there's nothing of personality here. There's nothing that distinguishes a KPMG in Austria with Australia to America, right? Or even, one you might find in like Nairobi. Perhaps there are some differences, of course, regionally and according to building codes and what is permissible. However, one of the big things about modernity, which I find really interesting, is that modern architecture, I think, is the greatest way we'll be able to archaeologically define what modernity is. So, for example, we see with the Roman Empire a few hundred years back, where there are Roman roads, you can expect to find other Roman pieces of technology or primary sources, and that's kind of how we tracked how big the Roman Empire got. Basically, until which points, until the Roman roads led, and other sorts of Roman, technologies being spread at that time. In a similar way, obviously this might not happen and it's kind of irrelevant for our discussion, but in a few hundred years, when people look back, possibly, if we're even around back by then as a species, when they look back, they'll have to look at the, archaeological evidence that they find, and what they're going to see is that all across the country in urbanized hotspots, it's like the same sort of architecture everywhere, right? It's these sort of banal, bland, blue, dark blue, white, black, gray sort of buildings, which are very geometric, no personality, and you can't, assuming everything inside is destroyed and the internet's no longer around, you're not going to be really able to decide whether or not that place has a separate culture or if there's some sort of globalized empire. And of course, there kind of is, right? The idea of modernity and globalization has gone so far that, even architecture is being standardized to a certain degree across the entire globe. And obviously, I'm not talking about all sorts of architecture, but when it comes to, production, there's a lot less emphasis on beauty and greatness, I guess. And we'll get into this very shortly. And I think that's really interesting to observe because it reflects a lot about the modern day and how obviously we always joke about how the World Economic Forum, globalization, and things, but using modern architecture as an axiom for where globalization has reached is a really interesting way to look at it. Where even in countries that are less well off, their capital cities and even some smaller economic hubs are always going to be very nice in the same modern way. And when you're looking to replicate the success of other places, you want to replicate how they look as well, the vibes, to attract investors, right? Even if you have multi-million-dollar equipment, you don't want to have it in a mud hut or even a decorated flammable wood building, right? I don't know, for thinking like Japan, right? You're gonna want to have it in one of these modern buildings, and part of that comes with, of course, the new technology, and you want to be able to make this efficient and sleek. But a lot of it also has to do with the changing standards and what we expect from the elites and how social value is earned. So that's a video for the future probably as well. But a lot of the perceptions of virtue with the elites has changed, right? Back in the day, it was about spending money. It was about, being lavish and having your name attached to everything. Donating so you can get a square named after you, right? And even up to, like, I guess, like the late Victorian times, that seemed to be the impression. But however, if you look at it now and the way things are done, there's a lot less emphasis on being lavish, and it's a lot more about attitude elitism because there's so much more prosperity now than there ever has been. You might want to dispute that. Times are hard for a lot of people. Yes, of course. However, the poorest person now is by far, by any means, much much richer in a lot of different ways than a lot of the more average to poor people back then. So basically we've elevated the standard of living for all people. That's not even a question to be asked. But in doing so, it's a lot harder to be exclusive when the technology available and afforded to elites are not really, by elites I mean like rich people, wealthy people, politicians, people in good families. You know what I mean. And so when there's a lot less exclusivity and material wealth afforded to them, it's much more tenable for them to express their elitism and their want to be superior or, as I keep saying, elite. They want to do that through attitudes and non-physical things, right? One of the examples I saw or heard about recently is Hamilton and plays. Obviously, opera and not opera. Broadway used to be, even me growing up, used to be seen as this, great thing where it's like, you have to be really smart to interpret it, and it's not really for a global audience, right? Hamilton was the big one, and a lot of people rejoiced in that in the elite circles, from what I hear, because of what it meant. It meant that you can afford to go to Broadway. It meant that you can afford nice seats. I mean that you can actually have the excess time, money, and even intellect to engage with that piece of work to understand it. However, as it went global, as Hamilton went on to Disney and Disney Plus, right, and as it became, widespread everywhere, it kind of lost that, edge. And Hamilton and Broadway in general isn't as much as, and, access to media isn't as much as an indicator for elitism. And thus it has shifted since to be about attitudes about things like, social justice. Can you afford to care about these things, and can you even have the right perspective? And, like the wealthiest people being socialists, for example, is the best thing. So Zohran Mamdani lost overwhelmingly with people making the least amount of money in New York City. And I think he won like white single woman the most or something, above like $250,000. Anyways, so the point being that the ways elites want to express their elitism has changed and shifted dramatically, whereas the poverty gap, of course, has sort of risen. The top 5% is definitely not, lives on par with the bottom 40, I want to say, in some cases. Again, not in all cases, but when it comes to having certain possessions. For example, having a cell phone, for most people, with a great plurality of people, is not a privilege anymore as much as, it's a sort of necessity to live in the modern day, with everything being digital now, right? And so the point is, wow, I keep, really repeating that. So if we get down to it, my point is trying to say the ways that, elites use money is not going to be to try to actually, flaunt their wealth, right? Flaunt their wealth, because not only are there, big disparities within the wealthy, they don't want to seem like that. Partially because of how looked down upon, the ultra wealthy are. They don't want to seem ultra wealthy, and obviously we all know it's very disingenuous. However, we do see and we can understand why that is the case. And so a lot of money and the sort of virtue or elitism is also done through philanthropy, and that's where a lot of the money goes. So instead of spending $50 million to make a public square, a public park in your name, you're going to spend $50 million donating to starving kids in Sudan. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I believe that we don't see a lot of patronage of great things anymore to the same degree that we did back in, when pre-19th, pre-20th century. And so I believe that is the reason or slash the source of how we've gotten to this point where now that corporations are in charge of, building, and there's not as much incentive for the elite, social elite, to actually invest in these things, make them look beautiful to reflect their own name, except for like having their own personal estates, I mean, of course, yes. Then what we get is a lot of, very sterile, indeed, grayscale type of buildings where it's just simply designed for profit and simply to have beneficial, like you're trying to make it look okay while being the most cost efficient as possible. And of course, you might, if you really want to get into it, there's like the whole art movements of the early 21st century, absurdism, 20th century, sorry. And even one of my favorite architectural works of the modernity, the Guggenheim de Bilbao in Spain. No, know if I'm saying that correctly. That is, again, that's an abomination when it comes to previous standards. I think it's pretty cool. However, again, does that really reflect anyone? And again, where's that money coming from? And again, who is it reflecting other than modernity as a globalized, this whole idea of modernity, right? Of, artistic integrity and all of that great things. So this gets us into a lot of different criticisms people have. So, I have a lot of Russian friends or post-Soviet Union friends whose parents and themselves have heard a lot about and seen what Soviet Russia is like. So we joke a lot about the Russian playground, the Soviet playgrounds that they had, which are all always the same, very, very, bare, but dangerous, but kind of fun is what I hear. But anyways, let's get into what are we looking at here? So this is a Soviet housing block, right? These were meant to be very, very, not lavish, anti-capitalist, because that's what capitalism meant back then, back in like, at least in the inception of what's it called? I guess let's go. If you truly believe that Lenin carried on the legacy of Marx properly, which sort of maybe, then you really hate the lavishness of people who became wealthy or people who were wealthy to begin with. Anyways, this is meant to make sure standardize everyone, make sure we all feel equal, and to make sure that you can build things as cost effective as possible without having to think about things like culture and religion, because despite it not being as bad as everyone says, there was still a great amount of erasure of culture to make uniformity within the Soviet system. And so a lot of criticism from the Americans then and now is that they made everything so ugly. Look at these blocks. Look at these ugly blocks meant to break people down. And there was absolutely a psychological element to it. If you looked around and all you saw was blocks, that has to be mentally damaging to some degree, especially when you've seen beauty beforehand. So, obviously we've gotten a lot better at building shit, but we're seeing the parallels, right? So so it's pretty self-explanatory. I'm trying to get to the point where like the Soviet era criticisms we had, where we're like, okay, they're trying to break people down with all this sterility and this grayscale architecture and these just blocks of stuff. We're seeing a lot of that when it comes to big cities nowadays. Now, of course, smaller cities with developments and housing have not changed, but we don't create beautiful, great things anymore when it comes to architecture because, again, there's not a palette for that, nor is there funding to do so because there's no one willing to put that money because it's not as attractive for the elites or to be patrons of great things to reflect their own name. It is rather better for them to spend that money doing things that help their reputational image in the public's eye. And so this all brings us to the main point. Why is the world so sterile? How have we gotten to this point? And we're going to get into the main points about suburbanization, which I promised that we would get to pretty soon. And then we'll do a little ending, wrap it up with how I feel like this reflects with whether or not this, counts as human psychological repression, where to go forward, and the final thoughts on what I believe went wrong. So this is, your quintessential American Midwest West suburban village, right? So you're gonna see a lot of this in the western parts, starting from the Appalachian Mountain, because of the way American history has gone. So then my history is a little bit spotty, but I believe it was like the Northwest Ordinances of like 1787 or like 89 or something, which expanded American land outwards past the Appalachian mountain to create little chartered areas, and this would be done through a grid system where grids or thousands of acres at basically penny cost now, where thousands of acres were spent. Sorry, a lot of money now, but pennies then, right? A lot of money was spent on gaining land in grid-like formats, leading to, again, as you keep going west, more grid-like patterns. Obviously, rural is its own thing, but when it comes to organized cities, you're going to see a lot of grid patterns with just houses on the corners and on the sides, just blocks, basically, right? And you even see that in some of the more seaside villages you see in the East Coast, right? If you want to think like Jersey City or Atlantic City or even Cape Cod to a certain extent. And it's very uniform. And in a lot of ways, again, it kind of resembles, in form alone, it resembles this. Where imagine like you're driving down a street, and instead of seeing big blocky buildings. You're just seeing the same house over and over again, with people trying to embellish how wealthy they are with the additions they have. Very similar houses, very similar thing, which is why there's so much sort of limit. It's like liminal, right? When you see empty suburban towns, just thousands and thousands of same looking houses on the same street, and this is, I believe, what is happening to America. So that the more suburban things get, there's less business, there's less stuff to do, and therefore less walkable in the actual area, leading to more cars, bigger roads, more gray because of concrete, and then, sidewalks, all gray, cars, black, white, gray, occasionally red or blue or orange if you're fancy or whatever, rich or weird, honestly. Don't get orange cars. So, a lot of the discourse, which honestly I might want to make like a long form video about this, kind of like the documentary about birth rates, it's really weird. I don't know. A lot of the criticism has to do with how it's not walkable, but also like I wouldn't want to walk in a gray city anyways. So ultimately, it comes down to just building styles being designed for being profit and having a profit incentive, and not having sort of that culture. A lot of that has to do with the again, national multinationalism of companies, I guess, or nationalism of companies, or nationalization of companies, right? No, that's not the right word. Not companies being over. The companies going multinational, basically. Basically means that companies are more profit driven because they have so many different constituent franchises, right? Where am I going with this? I lost my train of thought. Oh, right. And so basically, suburbanization has a big role in promoting this kind of thing, where everything seems more sterile, because of course when you're going through the same thing over and over again, there's not a lot of culture, of course you're going to see that kind of thing. And to that extent, I was thinking yesterday about like you can probably stack different sorts of not civilizations, cities based on what they look like. So one would be like, okay, at the very bottom stack you would have people just like homesteading, basically living in the middle of nowhere, one dirt road. Then tiny village, normal village, right? And these would be places that are mostly rural, one town square. You're gonna see a lot of this in the Northeast and the Midwest. So village, large village, it's a branch off or an older part of a suburban area. And then you have a village like suburban. This is going to be your places where it has, housing areas, but it also has a vibrant, downtown area, or it has some way to be walkable. And then you have high suburban, which is going to be something like this, where it's going to be extremely, extremely, sterile. And again, the more up you go, the more boring things get, and the more blocky things get, right? That is from a while ago. Wow. And then you get to you have urban suburban, which is like, kind of fun to say, but it's between suburban and urban, where you're gonna see things slowly turning into cities, right? Where it's like mass housing blending seamlessly into, the same city, but seamlessly blending into urbanism. And then you have like straight up cities, and then you have mega cities, right? You have like Chicago's to your Dubai's, right? It's a little bit different. And so the more up you go, you're going to see that there's more sterility, because again, there's more profit incentive, because corporations are more likely to own a lot of that land, and form like the biggest and baddest buildings will be the most boring. And so what are the solutions, I believe, about this, which is kind of the hardest part and the most important part if you really think about it. And I believe that the solution is for us to value, honestly breaking down virtue signaling. I believe that people are proud to be able to contribute, even with their own name on it. We're gonna get more great things from people who can actually afford to make great things. And then for example, like we would have never built a Notre Dame the way it is today. We would have probably built, even if were religious nowadays, a small chapel. It would have never been this multi-year project, which would have taken hundreds and hundreds of, probably millions of dollars. And then you have like Antoni Gaudi's Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Beautiful, right? Obviously there's a lot of critics, but we can all agree it's pretty beautiful. We would never have undertaken that project, of course, because Gaudi was an exceptional, brilliant architect, but also because we would never have wanted to spend that much money on something that didn't mean anything to us, because we are neither religious or vain anymore. And part of that, obviously, vanity isn't really that good, but you'll have some vanity, but also bring back sorts of traditional imagery, or at least create new imagery that isn't boring and sterile. Like This is clearly not cultural. This is not culture. This is simple psychological repression of humans by making them expect the same things over and over again and breaking it down to very Spartan, bare minimum conditions. And so that is my main point about this, right? You don't want to have a sterile society. And society is sterile because we don't want to have people having nice things. And so why is that, real? Is that class consciousness? We don't know. But the main thing I believe is that we need to restore vanity and have some sort of idea of what we want to believe as a society. Because without tradition, without anything, right, we're not going to have good things. And one of the most favorite quotes I like to always go back to is tradition is a solution to problems that we forgot about. So obviously, like, one of the biggest things that we have that we're dealing with right now is nihilism, right? A lot of lack of belief. And so what if traditional buildings always being so diverse and so beautiful across all sorts of civilization, any sort of traditional building style, that is a preservation of, what makes things beautiful, what makes us have, that wonder. And breaking that down doesn't really seem right because, again, perhaps that is a problem that we forgot about. That we need to inspire people, give them awe over things that aren't simply just breaking them down with the, with the, huge roads and no trees and no beautiful buildings and just blocks and blocks and repetition of the same stuff over and over again. So let me know what you thought about this video. It's definitely, again, good to be back. But as always, leave, comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, and I'll have a conversation with you down in the comment section down below. Thank you, and that's a Rhetoric Reviewed out.